welcome to today's episode of Rise Up Voices from the Frontline, presented to you by Battle to Be. And we are extraordinarily excited to bring a guest today that is part of the corrections family. And we don't often get to speak to representatives from that category. So I want to give you guys a window into that world of work and how it is similar and different to being a law enforcement officer out on the street, and just open some lines of communication to this unique set of challenges and benefits. So today I'm bringing to you Dr. John Lawrie. Hello.
Hello, how are you? Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to be able to talk about corrections because oftentimes there's a little bit of competitiveness and a little bit of snarkiness, of course, in between different first responder professions, and sometimes corrections is the redheaded stepchild of law enforcement, so to speak. So want to bring some voices forward from that line of work and show the world that it's not easy, and it's not what they think it is.
I absolutely agree, and like I said, it's definitely corrections is I find very underrepresented when we discuss criminal justice. So I am shamelessly pro corrections. Obviously, I fully support police, fire, EMS, and every other component as well. But it is nice to be able to have a voice for corrections. So I appreciate it, and thank you very much.
Right. So let's start by going way backwards. Let's talk about your family life when you were growing up. Was it a military or first responder environment for you?
Sure. So I grew up a long time ago. I was born in 1970. So when my father was Air Force, he was an Air Force veteran. So I did have that military history in my family. Raised in a working middle class environment. Both my parents, your traditional kind of suburban upbringing. There was never any law enforcement specifically in my family. I think I was the first person in my immediate family to go into law enforcement. And in fairness, I absolutely had no law enforcement aspirations whatsoever. So growing up, that was nothing that ever crossed my radar. And it wasn't until I got to college and realized that my plan of going to law school was much more expensive than I thought it was going to be. So I was out one night with some of my buddies. We were at a bar drinking, and I guess that's foreshadowing for a lot of other stories in my life. But we were out having a couple beers, and they asked, what are you going to do after graduation? Why don't you come with us to take the Connecticut DOC test? And I had no idea what the DOC was. They explained it was the prison. Wasn't really too thrilled, but as the evening progressed, it seemed to seem better and better. So long story short, I took the test. A few months later, I was offered a position, and a few weeks after that, I started the academy. So I ended up in corrections with, like I said, with no real preparation, no real expectations.
So a roll of the dice. I love that. That's not typically what I hear. Most people, are following in the footsteps of someone that they admired. I love the idea that you're spontaneous enough to just go, oh, hey, let's try that.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was definitely it. So I figured, my thought at the time was, I'll do it for a couple of years, save up some money, and I'll go back to law school later. And it's been 30 years, and law school's never been an option after that. So it seemed like a good idea at the time.
It's not such a big jump to go from being interested in rules and regulations, that law aspect, to moving into a profession like in corrections. Really? Do you see that parallel?
Oh, no, certainly. I mean, there's definitely, and again, depending on what area of, law you wanted to get into. For me, years ago, my interest was environmental law. But again, I think that was something that I had a general interest in. I didn't really know the specifics. It just sounded kind of good. And then, as I got into the department and as I started to, see how things work and how things operate, what was kind of unique for me, I was probably 11 minutes into my first day in the academy when I made myself a promise that I would not work a day past 20 because I had to, but only because I wanted to. So when I started the job back then, it was a 20-year retirement. So you work your 20 and, you could leave regardless of your age, which is a really great benefit. But I learned very quickly that this could be a career that could have some serious detrimental impact on mental health, physical health, and things like that. So very early in my career, I made a conscious decision to have a plan to make the transition if and when possible.
So really interestingly, as you say, that it can have a detrimental effect on mental health. I was just talking with someone who is leadership at a corrections facility, and we were talking about one of the programs that we offer in our organization. And the funny thing was, it immediately switched from how can we support the personnel to, well, that sounds like something that the inmates might need. So it was just really interesting to notice that thinking about mental wellness for the staff is secondary to thinking about the mental wellness of the inmate population. Is that something that you could comment on from your experience?
I absolutely agree. And what's kind of interesting about corrections is over the last 30 years, I've spoken to people in corrections from all over the country and some instances all over the world. And even though we've never met, we've never worked a shift together, we've never been in the same facility, same agency, the parallels and the commonalities between what we experience is uncanny. Staff morale, issues, all of those things are pretty much universal in corrections. And I'm sure that they exist in other fields as well, but I'm just much more cognizant of it in corrections. So, to your point, I have always been an advocate of staff wellness and development. And, for me, there was the educational component. While I was on the job, I got my master's, I got my doctorate, which was very rare in corrections. So that prepared me for my future career working in higher education. But beyond the educational development, what I started to recognize a lot more, as you said, is the need for mental health and medical health. And so now I work with a lot of individuals and we try and address those issues. One of the things I actually did is I just developed a program to help staff sort of transition through their career in corrections and beyond. And as you said, corrections is designed almost specifically to prepare the offender to reintegrate back into society effectively. And I think that's tremendous. That's what we need to do. I fully support that. But as you also said, sometimes that same effort is not extended to staff. And that's something I would really love to see. A lot of the programs, a lot of the things in my experience and in my opinion that focus on when it comes to corrections is specifically offender oriented. And again, while that's important, I believe that if you're going to have the greatest impact on a correctional population, it has to be a holistic approach and it has to incorporate and include staff as well, because they have to live in that environment while they're on the job. And I believe that would only be beneficial if agencies and departments put more of an emphasis on helping staff through their careers, as well as preparing them for what the next chapter of their life might be.
Right. We like to talk about an area that most people don't like talking about, and that is that transition period from the identity of officer or whatever your job, position, title is that you've claimed. That transition period from getting close to the end of your career and retirement to not having that identity anymore and how that affects people. You've mentioned that you address that transition period. So what is it that you've noticed that is so important about that stage of life, and what kind of actionable steps do you have for our audience in that?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's huge. So, if you begin a career in corrections, you get hired, you go through a 3-month academy, then you spend 9 months on your working test period, then you spend your career doing the job, doing your in-service training, being whatever it is, officer, captain, lieutenant, whatever your title is, but it's always correctional first. And then you retire, and the next day you are no longer that person. And in my personal experience, and a lot of individuals I worked with in the past, that was huge. I mean, when I was on the job, outside of the job, I was the prison guard. So if you associate with individuals, which I rarely did, outside of corrections, big, bald, scary looking prison guard was kind of my identity, and I kind of embraced that a little bit. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult to make that transition away, because it's literally it's a 24-hour difference. You wake up that next morning and none of that means anything moving forward. You can draw from the experiences you had, but you need to basically redefine yourself and create a new identity. Because in my experience, if you don't, that's probably the most detrimental, because those are the individuals I saw that just retired from the job, and their next full-time job was sitting in a bar, all day, all night, drinking and talking about how awful the job was and how miserable they were and how many ex-wives and alimonies and childs and all those horrible things that go with that, combined with how many funerals and wakes we've been going to for people who were on the job and recently retired. And I thought that was something that we absolutely need to address. When you look at the mortality rates, when you look at the suicide rates, the divorce rates, they're astronomical for corrections. And to change that identity and realize that you are capable of doing something else and becoming, whatever you want to be. Again, I can speak to my personal experience. Those sorts of things weren't necessarily encouraged when I was on the job. There was never any talk about, there was talk about what's your next rank in the system, but there was never any, hey, how's your family? How are the kids doing? What are you thinking about? If you blew your back out tomorrow and couldn't come back to work, what would you do? Do you have a plan? And that never existed. So that's one of the things I really try and focus on now. Talk to a lot of the younger staff and some of the senior officers, and let them know that corrections is kind of unique, because you basically know the day you start, the day you can leave. So you have that period of time to plan and prepare. And a lot of individuals do a really good job with it, and they're very successful, and they make that transition seamlessly, and it's great. But unfortunately, many don't. So I think it's important that we provide them with the skill sets necessary, addressing issues like medical health, mental health, familial relationships. People don't think about the impact on your family. If you were working the department for 25, 30 years, you were working multiple overtime shifts, and all of a sudden you're home all the time. They're always seeing you. And, corrections people in general tend to have little idiosyncrasies. So things that were done a certain way when you weren't around forever, and all of a sudden we're maybe critiquing or nitpicking or changing. And that has an impact on your family. Things like spirituality, religion, like I say, it's all of those aspects that are important to an individual that they really need to start to address and incorporate to make that transition more efficient.
Right. Address it all long before the time comes that you're
preferably yes start the earlier you can start the process, the better, but it's never too late. If you're retiring, it's better to start thinking about it. Obviously, it's like anything. It's better to start thinking about it early in your career, but it's never too late to start to develop the skill sets and the plan that you will need in order to do that. And it's kind of interesting because law enforcement in general, corrections, again, I can speak specifically, we always, no matter where we are, we have a contingency plan. If we go out to a restaurant with our family, we have a contingency plan. If we're walking in the mall, if A, then B, and we do that all the time for the safety and security kind of thing. But I find that we very rarely have that contingency plan for ourselves and for our, career transition and just overall health. And I think that's something that, we possess the skill set. We just need to change the direction of how we focus it.
I like that. Access point, exit plan. It's still the same thing. Access points and exit plan.
Exactly.
Parallel language.
Yes.
So we often talk about retirement.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about the risk of suicide at different phases of employment. And statistically speaking, we know that retirement is a high risk time for law enforcement officers in general. So, but what we don't talk about that you've already kind of briefly touched on is the physical toll that the high stress professions take on your life and the increased risk for medical problems. Would you have anything to?
Absolutely. We know that the average life expectancy of the U.S. citizen is 77, and the average life expectancy of someone who retires from a career in corrections is just about 58. So, statistically speaking, we live 19 years less than the general population, and we tend to. And this is, and again, this is statistics are relative. I heard about this 20 years ago. Didn't really think about it as much. 58 when you're 25 is one thing. 58 when you're 53. Then it's a little different approach. So, the closer, again, on paper, I got 5 years left. So obviously I'm doing everything I can to extend that, but that's a reality. So, and we can't argue that. I worked at one facility my entire career. Granted, it was the largest facility in the state of Connecticut, but in that 20-year period, I believe I went to 35 wakes and funeral services for coworkers just at that facility. The oldest individual was 51. So, it's, so heart attack, stroke, suicide, also a lot of motorcycle car accidents, because it involves that, that we tend to generate gravitate towards more high risk behaviors. And then later in my career, as the opiate issue grew, we had the overdoses, and, officers who, some of the most squared away, former military special, individuals that were heroes, hurt their knee, hurt their back, and all of a sudden, 6-8 months, a year later, I don't even recognize them, because of those detrimental, as you said, the physical effects. So I think it's imperative that as a collective agency, corrections, we do everything we can to make sure that we are taking care of our staff as well as possible, because as I'm being redundant, our staff are going to take care of the goals and objectives of corrections. The better we can prepare them, the better we can care for them, the better they can do the job, in my opinion.
We're seeing a lot of trends in law enforcement in having challenges with recruitment and retention. Is that situation following through in the corrections environment as well?
Absolutely. I talk to a lot of, I deal with a lot of correctional agencies, a lot of correctional academies specifically, all over the country, hundreds, if not thousands of individuals. I spoke to one individual who was a sheriff in Southwest Texas, and he was the only person to ever tell me that they have more applicants than they have positions available. Other than that, so wherever that county in Texas is, whatever they're doing is fantastic. But anywhere else, it's a huge issue. And, there's a lot of reasons. Corrections historically, when I started the job back in 1993, the reason we had a 20-year pension, the reason we had all those benefits, is because no one wanted the job. It's a very dangerous job. There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown. I've been a criminal justice professor, specifically in corrections, for 25 years now. So whenever I teach my classes, I try and talk about corrections. I try and talk it up. And I've actually had quite a few students come through my program and go into the field of corrections. And that was really good. And I still do. One interesting kind of caveat to this was I've had a few students, and at first I couldn't believe it, but then there started to be a little bit of patterns, about 3 or 4, who made it through the testing process, got through the interview process, and turned the job down when they realized that they could not bring their cell phones into the facility with them during their shift. The idea of having to leave their cell phone in the car for 8 or possibly 16 hours was something they could not offset in order to take that position of employment.
Interesting. I wonder if that has to do with that sense of security that I can't actually get help for myself if I don't have my phone on my person. Like that creates a vulnerability that I don't. That would be my first impression. Is
Sure.
my first reaction would be, oh, but if I get in trouble, I have no access to the outside world. I can't call for help.
And that very well could be. Unfortunately, mine is because I can't go that long without checking my social media. And again, and I know, obviously, as the old guy in the new, and it's always the generation. But I talk to a lot of individuals on the job, and there is, and it's the same thing that the guys in the staff that started back in the 60s and 70s said about us when we started in the 80s and 90s. That's just human nature. But it's in my experience and speaking with people, it's definitely something. Some departments I've heard have gone to where officers can bring them in, and they can be given breaks after a certain amount of time to check their cell phones and things like that. But I mean, this is just one example. But it speaks to the point. Recruitment for criminal justice in general is difficult. That's and I've you look at Connecticut State Police. Historically, Connecticut State Police was one of the most sought after state police departments in the country. You would have 500, 600, 700 applicants list every time. Now they're struggling. So, and those are the glamorous jobs, the policing, and corrections. As you said when we started, corrections doesn't have that reputation. I've in the 30 years that I've been involved in this, I've met one person whose career aspirations from the time they could remember were to work in a prison. Most people want to be a state trooper. They want to be a local PD, or they want to be FBI, DEA, and they'll come in using it as a stepping stone. But unless it's, I guess in some areas, it could be generational. If those are, some facilities I know in some more remote areas, those are the only industry in the area. But, working in Connecticut over a 30-year period, I met one individual who from the time that they were little, all they ever wanted to do was work in a prison. So again, it's not, generally speaking, it's not the sort of thing that most people, most kids aspire to. And I think all of those issues make the whole recruitment and retention thing that much more challenging because, a lot of departments may not pay that well. And I've had students tell me, they're like, I can make more money sitting on my couch doing drop shipping. Why am I going to go out and risk my life or get spit on and be assaulted and be threatened? And it's difficult for me to answer that. You know what I mean? It's if that's the situation we're in, that's difficult to compete with.
Right. So I would assume, and I don't have experience talking with a lot of people from the corrections environment, but from law enforcement in general, most people say the reason that they get into it is because they want to help people, because they want to make something different or better for people. So in corrections, my perception would be that you would go into that because you want to change the lives of the incarcerated. You want to change outcomes for these people. Do you feel like that's something that people tend to go in for? And is there a period of disillusionment that happens because of that idealistic desire?
Certainly. And again, this is not a blanket. Everybody has a different view and opinion. Corrections, like all forms of law enforcement and public safety, is a type of service. So you have to have a certain mindset going into those types of career if you're going to be successful for a long period of time. I often said that I wish I had a marketable skill set. I wish I was a framer. You show up in the morning on the work site, there's a pile of wood, you leave at the end of your shift and you framed out a garage. There's something tangible that you can see you actually made a difference. You accomplished something. Corrections is not like that. It's on the daily operations, pretty much in my experience, the way you measure a successful day in corrections is if everybody that you were with in roll call left at the end of the shift without being hurt and there were no major or critical incidents. Certainly, you can have an impact on an offender's life. You can be a role model. You can be a mentor. You can see changes. And over the course of the 30 years, 20 years I've been doing it, and then the last 10 that I've been involved, I've seen dozens of guys that I had, as inmates, come through and get out and be very successful, and that is rewarding. It's nice to see, but the reality is, it's a process. It takes a great deal of time before it bears any fruit, and it's really not as common as it should be given the size of our population. So yeah, when you talk about, helping people and making a difference, I think it is much, I guess, easier or more likely if you are a firefighter, if you are a police officer, if you are an EMT. But again, in my experience, one of the issues working in a prison setting is it's a prison setting. And it takes a tremendous toll on you. And I think you mentioned, cynicism, and absolutely. I mean, you can have the greatest intentions in the world, but if you're not careful, the job can absolutely destroy you. It can absolutely beat you down. So again, why it's so imperative that we provide staff with the tools necessary to cope with that and continue to do the job as effectively as they can.
So I want to make sure that people kind of get the idea of the good side too, because obviously you went in and you loved it and you stayed for a long period of time, and it was the right career for you, and it was difficult and challenging, but it also nourished your soul. So let's talk a little bit about, like, what are the things about the job that you absolutely loved and that gave you those feelings of accomplishment, and why you stayed?
Absolutely. And again, it is not all bad. There are absolutely tremendous benefits. And so, one of the things that to this day, I miss most, and I think anybody I talk to who's retired, is the camaraderie. It's the individuals you worked with, the other staff members, and in some instances, some of the inmates, you never develop a friendship, but you have a certain rapport. I mean, the average sentence in McDougal was 75 years. Most guys were doing life, and I was there. So there were guys that I knew for 20 years, locked up. So you interact with them, you associate with them. You have some really deep conversations, philosophical, about sports, about whatever. So those interactions I miss every day. The individuals and the people I worked with, that was probably one of the things that kept me able to do the job. Beyond that, as I said, is kind of refocusing my approach to how I was going to get through it. And for me, a lot of the staff I worked with had trades. They were plumbers, electricians, landscapers, whatever the case may be. So they took the job with the DOC to get the benefits and get the pension. So they would work as little overtime as possible. They would work all their side jobs for additional money. They would retire and then do their job, and they would be set because they worked for themselves and they were covered. And that was a brilliant plan. And for anybody that can do that, I strongly recommend it. As I mentioned, I possess zero skill sets. I can't fix anything, but I can talk. So I sort of fell into the teaching. So for me, it was academia. About 5 years into my job, when I was going to go back to law school, I actually went back to get my master's in criminal justice. It took me 2 years. I completed that. And on the day that I finished my last test for my master's, the individual who was the CJ professor in charge of corrections notified me that he was retiring and asked if I would be interested in replacing him. And his name was Hank DeLuca. He was actually retired New York State DOC, 30 years, tremendous individual. I owe the majority of my teaching career to him because I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. I said, Hank, what do you mean? Like a college professor? I'm like, Hank, I'm a prison guard. He's like, no, you understand it. So long story short, just to sort of placate him, I said, yeah, sure. Let the chair know I'm interested. And 2 weeks later, the chair reached out to me and offered me the position. So I was an adjunct for about the last 13 years of my career. So I did my master's, and I knew that I loved the teaching and it's what I wanted to do. But one of the next steps I had to do was get my terminal degree. So I had to go back for my doctorate. So for my last 4 years on the job, I was a unit manager at McDougall, so I worked the facility during the day. I was an adjunct in the evening, and I was doing a full-time doctoral program in between. It was absolutely as miserable and horrendous as you imagine it might have been. But I joked that was my ticket to parole. So my getting that terminal degree, it allowed me to be able to retire at my 20-year mark, as I promised myself back in the academy, but still be relative in the field and continue to build on the things that I learned and worked on, and now had a much better forum to do those things. So when I got to Albertus Magnus College, I just basically worked on blowing up our corrections component, because again, all CJ schools talk about policing. All schools talk about fire. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of law schools. Very few programs focus on corrections. So that's pretty much where we myself and our department have placed our resources. And it's been a really great endeavor for the last 10 years. I know people who work in corrections, I think, are genuinely thankful, because the classes are taught by corrections professionals or people who have actual experience doing the job, and not someone who read a book about working in a prison once. So, that's a really great thing. And, like I said, it's another thing that kind of made the job, and again, for me, was kind of unique. Relatively speaking, it was only a short period of time. Chronologically, it was only 20 years. And that was something that, at the time was, appealed to me, to be able to leave when I wanted to, not have to do, if I wanted to, that was an option. So again, that was just one more thing that it was kind of beneficial about it. But again, I feel that I think that people who work in corrections sort of sell themselves short sometimes when it comes to thinking that they're maybe not marketable for jobs beyond corrections. While there may not be a lot of maybe hard skills, like I left the department having almost zero aptitude when it came to using a computer. We didn't use spreadsheets. We didn't use a lot of technology. I joked that when I started the job, we had the handwritten to-froms with the multi-copy. To this day, I have no idea what goldenrod was, but it went in the warden slot, and you would literally put your pink copy here, your white copy here. And we had Polaroid cameras for our crime scene photos. So the technology, I was lacking a great deal when I left from that. But I think the soft skills, specifically the ability to communicate with people, the ability to read situations, the ability to assess things, work through traumatic and stressful situations, I think those skill sets can be applied at a much broader level than many staff give themselves credit for.
Right. Knowing how to market yourself and your experiences and those proper words to use for the things that you've experienced. There's always ways to make it sound very different to yourself. I definitely agree that we don't, in general, in society, place enough value on soft skills, especially communication and problem solving. And those are key to success in any environment. It doesn't matter whether you're a teacher or an emergency room tech or an investigator. Those skills are extraordinarily important. So recognizing those marketable skills and recognizing the value of the work that you do outside of the facility, just being able to say, not I'm just a corrections officer or I'm just a guard, which I hear all the time. I'm just a guard. I just do parole, or whatever it is. I'm just this. I'm like, let's take that out of there, because that says you do not value your own work. So if you're going to identify yourself as this thing, put some value in there and say, I am this. Or better, I would love to hear you say, I do this.
Yeah. And you're 100% right. And obviously guilty as charged. You go back and rewind it. That was my response to DeLuca, because that, at that time, that was the culture. So like anything else, I think we need to change the culture in every way, in the vernacular, in the perceptions, in the expectations. All those things need to, and you were absolutely spot on with it. Change, for me, once I started that, so once I started to get into academia, so I joked that I spent 20 years running cell blocks in the largest maximum security prison in New England, and now I'm an academic at a small Catholic college of the Dominican tradition. So two very, I don't know if you could find more polar opposites when it came to work environments. But that experience for me working in higher ed allowed me to see that, and to see that the value and the worth it took me to get outside of corrections to see the value and worth of my career in corrections. Because, unfortunately, and again, I can speak to my time, it was pretty depressing, and, and morale maybe wasn't that great, and everybody was kind of collectively miserable. And, it's human nature. And if you just identify as just a prison guard, I think in a lot of ways that's a coping mechanism or defense mechanism, because then the expectation isn't that high. You're not challenging yourself. You're not thinking, my first day on the job, I never thought that 20 years later I would have a doctorate and be a chair of a criminal justice department. But it took that process for me to be able to see that that's something that I could accomplish. And every individual has whatever that path is for them. And you're absolutely right. We have to change how we see ourselves so we can effectively become the types of individuals we need to be good for the job, good for ourselves, and good for our families.
Let's talk about something. We're going to take a sharp left turn here. Let's talk about, you mentioned the relationships with inmates. Mm-hmm. And I've briefly touched on this with another guest who worked with sex offenders, basically. Mm-hmm. And he spent a lot of time with them, and we talked about the moral challenge that you face when you're spending all this time with these people. How do you balance these relationships that are established, and these even friendships to some extent? You respect each other and you connect with each other. How do you balance that moral challenge that you face when you go, but this person did this, and I'm still having feelings about, that this is kind of a cool person to hang out with?
Okay. Yeah, no, I completely get what you're saying. And it's difficult. It's a difficult balance to strike. And again, I can only speak to myself, personally. So the individuals that I found I had the best sort of rapport with. So this isn't, so I can, and people who work in corrections also share this, but outside of corrections, this is an odd statement. I know thousands of murderers. I know thousands of guys who killed people for whatever, multiple people for whatever the reasons were.
Right.
Generally, and obviously in society, the most heinous crime we can imagine, and absolutely so. But broadly speaking, many of those individuals were some of the best inmates I was able to deal. Oftentimes it was a one-time, the number of individuals who was a one-time crime of passion, they never got in trouble in their lives before. And again, don't get me wrong. We had individuals who I wanted nothing to do with, who committed. The point is, I guess whatever, and again, it's a fine line between an effective working relationship. I had inmates that I saw for every day for 20 years, and, the extent of the conversations, morning, Mr. Smith, morning, Mr. Lawrie, whatever the case may be. And then, there were some that, just kind of through attrition over time, I was into strength sports. So certain inmates were into strength sports. We talked about strength sports. Had a little bit of an affinity for art. So inmates were into. So you have different, just like in regular, with our regular everyday contacts, you may speak. There are different people you speak to about kind of different things. And you're right. It becomes a challenge to strike that balance between being polite, communicative, and relaying personal information. the individuals that I had the best rapport with never asked me for anything, never asked me to bring them anything, never asked me for any favors. And also I think a lot of it comes with time. I don't recommend, or, it took me 5, 10, sometimes 15 years of dealing with someone on a regular, to get to that level. But, there are individuals, I can think of 3 or 4 guys I know who finished their sentences. They all did at least 25 years. They served their time. They're out, and they'll come and speak to my classes, or we'll get together and grab a coffee and just see how they're doing. I mean, they have finished their sentence. They're in society. They're doing the things they should be doing. And oftentimes we share the common goal. We want to, I want to see the same thing as they do. They just have a much different perspective as to how to achieve that. I see the side through the lens of custody. They see it through the lens of someone who was incarcerated. So there are times that we can, we network and we work together, and we'll speak at different events. And I find it very beneficial. It's an interesting balance. And what I see it with is, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Norwegian prison system, the Norway model. People talk about the Norway model as, the cutting edge system and way to operate a prison. In there, it's much more of a normal community. Staff sit down and play chess with the inmate. They talk to the inmate. They communicate at a much more personal level. And those are and again, for me, someone who never experienced that, one of my biggest struggles is seeing things through the lens of a practitioner who did the job, and seeing through the lens of an academic who theoretically studies things. I understand the theoretical component of how that will be beneficial, but there's also that part of me that goes back to what we call undue familiarity and being manipulated or played. Because if the inmate feels that you're being compassionate to them,
right,
maybe overly compassionate, then that creates a problem. Which I said, the whole thing is a very delicate balancing act. And the only way I think you can effectively accomplish it is to go through it. Again, maintain a strong ethical, theory, not do anything you're not supposed to do. But I think you can still, have conversations and engage in discussions with offenders and not have it be inappropriate.
So I think one of the challenges is the boundary between the punitive concept. if I'm hearing all of this correctly, the boundary between the punitive concept and the relational rehabilitatory concept, and the fact that we're all human beings, both the incarcerated and those employed in corrections. So we have human interactions, and the lines are a little bit blurry as to what is the reason or the effect outcome that we're looking for in this environment. Is that
Exactly.
I'm coming from an academic theoretical perspective only.
And that's exactly it. So, what is your justification for punishment? Are you looking for retribution? Are you looking for deterrence? Are you looking for incapacitation? Are you looking for rehabilitation? And they're not mutually exclusive. I believe most people, if you ask them what the goal of corrections is, there's a component of punishment. So there's the retribution. There's the component of deterrence, where if you lock one person up for doing something, specific deterrence, that person will never do it again. And or general deterrence, society will see that, and therefore they will be less likely to. There's the component of rehabilitation. We know that 2.3 million people incarcerated, about 95% will eventually be released. So there has to be a rehabilitative component. So again, I don't feel that any of them are mutually exclusive. And it depends on what the view, in my experience, what society is at the time. So when I started back in 1993, that was right. That was the results of the Get Tough on Crime, the War on Drugs, the 1994 Crime Control Bill. Prisons were opened up all over the country. The prison population exploded. Now we're starting to see that pendulum swing the other way. And each has good and bad consequences. In my opinion, like anything else, the key is trying to thread the needle in that sweet spot. How do you employ the least amount of punishment necessary to achieve the greatest outcome desired? And the problem is, and again, this is where I go, the populations are different. So as I said, I worked at a maximum security prison. So the individuals I dealt with, some of them were some of the most horrendous, heinous crimes. Those individuals will never be out of prison, and they should never be out of prison. So, I fully support the theory, and I agree that oftentimes we have far too many people incarcerated for crimes they probably shouldn't be. Nonviolent drug offenses, marijuana offenses, things like that. But again, that's where I struggle with practitioner versus theoretical, because those weren't the populations I worked with. There is the reality of when you are surrounded by some individuals who are that violent, who are that predatory, who are that dangerous, it tends to skew your view, and you find it more difficult to be more. And I can, again, speaking for myself, I have become much more objective and much more open to, changing the way we address punishment the longer I've been out of the system. Like I don't have, and I think it's because I'm not in that environment so much. I think that I'm able to be, again, I think I'm able to view things more objectively because I've removed sort of the visceral component of, again, because even if it's, you can have 99 great encounters a day, but the first time someone tries to stab you, it's a bad day. You know what I mean? So it's like anything. It's a disproportionately low amount of your time. But when we talk about PTSD and trauma, and things like that, it has a huge impact on how, for me personally, how I process things. And I'm aware of it, and I know that, and I try to be more conscious of it, and I try to be more understanding. I try to be more empathetic. And in fairness, I think it is easier the longer I'm out of that environment.
So we were just talking before the show about some new things in your life, some new directions that you're taking. So let's get everybody on board of what are you doing now that's you're still impacting your career, you're still impacting the academic world, but you're also reaching backwards to your people again. So let's talk a little bit about what are you doing now to stay involved.
Yes, and as I said, shamelessly pro corrections, and here's where that plays out. So obviously, in my official professional capacity, associate professor and chair of criminal justice at Albertus Magnus College. But I'm also, I just started a webpage and a business basically on career coaching for correctional professionals and addressing some of the things we've talked about here, helping individuals kind of prepare themselves to effectively and successfully do the job, but also plan beyond the job. Best case scenario, they work a 25-year career, they get everything lined up, and they're able to make that transition seamlessly and be very, very, very effective in it. And that's great. But unfortunately, given the nature of the job, they may get hurt tomorrow. Have a plan for that. What are you going to do if, again, we go back to the contingency planning. What are you going to do if X happens, to have that plan? So, that's something that I just started doing. And I'm also I'm work with an agency, the Stonington Institute in North Stonington, Connecticut, and we operate a military first responder trauma rehab center, which we're extending to now include first responders, police, corrections, etc. So I'm working on the again, all corrections related, but three kind of different areas: the academic side, the professional side, and the medical and mental health side. So and again, we were speaking before we came on. I think it's imperative that we have individuals from our respective law enforcement communities to help other staff members. And there are a lot of really great organizations working with police and working with fire, but to the point we talked about earlier, some of those don't include or recognize corrections, or EMTs, or emergency response operators. And I think it's really important that we expand that net as wide as possible, and that we all support each other the best that we can.
Right. It's always interesting to me when I've not had any trouble with guests that I've had on the show, but I have interviewed a lot of people. I do a pre-interview, as you know. I do a pre-interview with people to determine if we want to do the show together, and to see if we can share the message together in a way that comes across really nice. And there are two different mentalities in this industry. There is the I'm just a drop. I always say I'm just a drop in the ocean, and but when we all come together and speak with the same voice, we create a tidal wave of change. So I play really well with others, and I think that the way that we're going to actually achieve our goals is to communicate together and to create these systems and to try to standardize some processes that can play in all these different places. And the only way we can do that is by working together. And then there's the other side of that there's a lot of people here. There's a lot of organizations that they want their voice to be the only one that's heard. They want to make all the money. They want to be, the creator of a system that is theirs, and it's very expensive, and, they don't share and they don't play well with others. And they create a negative atmosphere for all of us, because a lot of organizations, a lot of, police departments or whatever have dealt with them in the past, and their promises were empty. And they said, give me $10,000, I'll come in and fix your department. We'll change it from top to bottom. And then nothing happened. Like, it was just another box junk thing. But as we all start to come together, we're realizing that we all have the same answer. We're all working on the same basic principles, and they're not anything we don't already know. Like, all of this stuff has been around for centuries. All of this stuff we already know. We're just afraid to take the time and energy to admit that we need it as a culture, right? We're just not willing to say, I have to actually breathe. I have to actually fix my mindset. I have to actually take time for myself in my life.
100%. I made a career of responding to the question, how are you? I'm okay. I'm okay. Fine. I'm fine. I'm okay. And you're absolutely right. And I could not agree with all of your sentiments. And that's, I think, it's like, collectively, if we realize that we're all working for the same goal, it just makes it that much more effective. I believe that the more inclusive we can be, the more successful and effective we're going to be. So I absolutely share those sentiments. And to your other point about individuals and the motivation behind, are they truly trying to accomplish something, or they have the ulterior motives? When all is said and done, there's usually more said than done. So I'm not interested in what you have to say. I'm interested in what you have to do. How are you actively trying to achieve those goals? What are you doing? What is your approach? And for anyone out there who's watching, if I would be more than happy to work with you, and all, even if it's not corrections, we all want to accomplish the same thing. So if we can utilize our resources and pool those resources and work together, I think that we can really have a tremendous impact on the population as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely, if you're in trouble, if you're out there and you're struggling and you don't know what to do, we answer the phone. So if you've called, and I hate to say this, but I need to, if you've called a suicide hotline and been hung up on, or if you've called a suicide hotline and spent 3 hours on hold, and you just want to talk to somebody normal, somebody who knows, somebody who will just sit and listen to you, I have a list of people who will answer the phone. And I already know without even asking you that you're one of those people, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's another area that I actually didn't get into. Yeah, I work with an organization called Responders First, and that's basically what we do as well. It's individuals from various law enforcement backgrounds working together to just, again, try and get individuals the help they need, so they're able to deal with the issues they have and successfully transition through and hopefully get to where I am in retirement, enjoy it, because it's really not too bad now that I'm here. It's nice. So I just try and do what I can to make the journey a little bit smoother for those individuals who are quite aren't here yet.
So I will make sure that the links are in the description for the show, that you have access. And if you want to reach out to either of us, you can do that. We'll put the links for some of the organizations that have been mentioned and make sure that you can find all that information. And please, if you're struggling out there, know that there are tons of resources for you out there. I know it can be difficult to find the ones that are right for you. Don't give up. Don't stop trying, because the right resources are there for you. Just maybe hiding in unexpected places. So are there any last words that you want to leave our audience with? What's your words of wisdom quote?
I would like to, deeply thank you for this opportunity. I think what you're doing it's tremendous. I think there's an audience that's very receptive to it. And again, I just reiterate, if you are out there and you are watching this and you are struggling and you have any concerns, or you have things that you think you need to address, trust me, I've been there. For me personally, I probably waited too long to address those. So reach out. The assistance is available. And speaking for myself, we'll do whatever possible to help you through and get you where you need to be.
Thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, so much for being with us today. If you enjoy this podcast and you would like to see us be able to continue, you can support us at battle2be.org, BATTLE2be.org. And as you probably already know, we do not charge for our services for our military first responders or for their families. And that goes for our memorial services as well as for our helping services. So know that we are funded entirely by community members and corporate sponsors. So if you'd like to be a corporate sponsor of our podcast, please just email us at battle2be@yahoo.com. And we would love to see what kind of partnership we can create that's a win-win for both of us. And we make excellent brand partners. And we also love working with other nonprofits to create systems that elevate first responder and military lives. So reach out to us if you would like to know more about what we're doing. If you would like to connect and maybe work on some projects together, or if you would like us to bring Phoenix the Memorial Jeep out to an event or have one of our speakers. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again next week at Rise Up, Voices from the Frontlines.